Hello everyone! So enough people enjoyed the first video that I've decided to do a second part to it, so this is mimicking video game fighting styles. Name is still very much in progress. But if you haven't seen this series before, basically what it is the idea is I'm going to take characters from video games and I'm going to practice their move sets and break down little pieces of it and see what characterization we can learn about them from, or if any techniques are identifiable from other sources. Now, this isn't meant to be a realism analysis or anything along those lines. Other channels do that. There's some really good ones about that. And neither am I going to spend the whole video saying, you shouldn't spin in a sword fight, blah, 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 blah. That's not the point. The point of this is to look at the interesting little bits of how each character moves, make some speculation about why they move that way, etc., and just generally have a little bit of fun. So, today we're going to be continuing with For Honor. Last time we did the Oruchi, and fuck the pronunciation again. Anyway, last time we did the Samurai Hero, and then the Berserker. Today we're going to be going over the Highlander, and then the Gladiator from For Honor. So, when it comes to the Highlander, he's a bit of an interesting guy. I do not have a great sword, so I'm just using one of my larger wooden wasters, but to be honest, I wouldn't want to use a great sword doing Highlander's moveset, because looking at the way he moves and the weight that he's throwing around, I really think that his moveset was perhaps originally designed for a different hero. I think that maybe they wanted to do a Viking hero who had just a large, basically branch or club, and that they kind of shoehorned in the Highlander with the claymore. It's just a bit of a strange one. I'll go more into it as we go through his moveset, but oftentimes the Highlander doesn't necessarily use it much like a sword. He uses it like a very heavy object, and we'll get more into, how he uses it less like a sword in a moment here. But basically, all of his moves are acting like this thing is at least 40 pounds, which is, it's interesting because of the way he has to stand. So, for example, let's go over his general stance. So, he's got both hands pretty low, with the flat of the blade resting on his shoulder. Now, his grip would be much longer, so his hand is usually around here-ish, and then his bottom hand is all the way down here. But usually one is much closer to the pommel. And when he shifts guard, he does a little shoulder shrug, and it's pretty much just the same thing on the other side. He does not switch hands, though he does switch hands in some other moves. But, so, his medium guard on left, his medium guard on right. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. Now, his high guard, he moves up and actually rests the blade onto his shoulder. This isn't a great idea to do with a sharp sword. They do cut very well, and I've got quite a few friends who have cut themselves down to the bone doing things like this. And furthermore, we know that the Highlander's sword is sharp, because one of his emotes, he partially falls asleep and cuts himself on his sword. So, we know it's sharp, probably not the best idea, but either way, he puts it up onto his shoulder, elbows are slightly out, posture's upright, again, a pretty straightforward guard. So, here, here, here. Those are his defensive stance guards. Now, for his attack out of them, when he comes to do a light, he does something a little bit strange, which is he will take whichever hand is on the side the attack is coming from, put it onto the blade, and then attack with a small chop, basically using it like this. Now, does that move exist in other things? Yeah, I mean, you can slash with, for example, a bayonet, you can slash when you're standing in the half sword. That's not crazy or all that uncommon. And I think the reason the Highlander is doing it this way is because if he commits the tip out there, the center of mass will pull him forward, because he is using a heavier weapon. So instead, he is putting both hands on for a quick hit, keeping the center of mass really close to him, so he can recover back. And when he chains things together, it makes a little bit more sense. But if he attacks on this side, his right hand goes on top. If he attacks from this side, his left hand goes on top. And if he attacks from up high, it's his right hand again. But altogether, a pretty simple, relatively structured and non-committal light. He's not really throwing himself forward all that much with it. So, then he goes into his heavies. And his heavies are where things get interesting. Because depending upon how he chains into them, he will do a little bit of a skip, which is an interesting one. Because the skip reminds me very much of practitioners of the Highland games, in regard, especially when it comes to stone put or hammer throw, things like that. You will often see that little movement to settle in and then the throw itself. And when he goes to do a heavy, usually on the move, you will see that little skip appear. I don't know if that's what they were going for, but if so, it's a really cool homage. But when he goes to do a heavy, you will usually see a little skip in, at which point, I'm doing that incorrectly, he uses back foot front. There it is. So you will usually see that sort of swing. Now, like I said before, the Highlander does not have great edge alignment. And I think the reason is because if you look at his hands when he swings his heavies, he has the tendency to move his lead hand down. Now, obviously his hand isn't getting quite as close as mine is to my other one, but this is actually not an uncommon mistake to make when you're first learning swordsmanship. Your hand just slips down or you're trying to gain a little bit of reach, but the issue is, with that gap there, you lose a lot of sense for where the edge is. It's the strangest thing, but you do lose a lot of it. And so I think what's happening is he is letting the weight go out, casting it slightly, and that's causing him to lose that sensation. But the weapon's so heavy, he doesn't really care if he hits with the flat or with the edge. Because that is the other thing we've seen about Highlander's sword is it doesn't flex at all. It is just a huge lump of steel. So, when he goes for his heavies, you will often see he doesn't necessarily step all the way up, and I probably will on reflex a couple times while doing this, but usually he steps just up to the level and is actually kind of leaning back away from it to counter the weight before he puts his weight back into it. So usually what you'll see is something along these lines. Then he'll settle back into guard. So over, smack, back here, then he'll settle back in. Now when he chains a light and a heavy together, let's go over heavy from a different direction. So right to left, pretty straightforward. Left to right, pretty straightforward. Over the top, a little different. When he goes for over the top, up, and he will squat down, a little more square than that. So for example, if I were to do a light from my right, followed by a heavy over the top, you will see, boom, boom, that sort of thing. And as I said in part one, I'm not necessarily used to all this spinning, so it's not going to look as good as when they do it. But another example would be if you did light from right followed by heavy from right. Boom, spin, through. If he does a heavy from left, however, he will light, bring it back up, heavy. So he will just bring it up and prepare and swing through. That's not all that weird. Now, his combos really are pretty simple. They're usually like light, heavy, heavy, or heavy, heavy, the lowland slashes. That one's pretty simplistic. He just through, using the momentum with both. Nothing crazy. Now, where it gets interesting is when we start getting into his more complicated moves, which are odd. They're very interesting in the way that he puts them together. So, for example, we have his dash attack, which is he will rush forward and come up into this very upright stance, and then when he goes to chop down, he will only chop with one hand. I'm not exactly sure why, especially because in the preparation for doing it, he has both hands on for a moment, then takes it off. I don't know. He can also take that, and instead of coming straight down, he will turn to one side or the other. And this one was decently fun to practice, but he will, from here, dash up, faking it, then he will spin one way or the other. So in this case, I'm going to go to my left, step, swing. He's keeping the weight very up He's keeping himself very erect. It's a very nice pirouette, as opposed to the low down sort of movement that we saw from the assassins last time. So here's that again. Up, upright and over. Now if he does it on his other side, he will up, he'll take his right hand off for that cut. So whichever side you're going, that's the side the cut is coming from via your hand. Now, next up, we have his offensive stance. So this switches things up rather considerably. So when he goes into his offensive stance, his guards change. For one, his guards become down here for his medium guards, and then his high guard becomes one-handed. It actually starts going down his back, which is interesting, to say the least. But for his offensive stance, he drops down basically into Nabenhut, and it's a pretty, it's cool to see that guard. You don't see it very often. But what he does from here is he will, for his lights, launch into a pommel attack, just a quick, and just a little step forward with the pommel going for the head. If he's up here, same idea, boom, nothing crazy. But now we get into the fun one, which is whenever he takes the offensive stance on his left side, he switches to being left-handed. And that leads to probably the strangest guard transition I've ever seen in a video game, which is when the Highlander goes from right to left, or left to right, in his offensive stance low, rather than doing this to change guards, in which case we'd move the sword in front of us. He leaves the sword pretty much where it is, slides his hand up, steps around, and does a little spin. So I'll show that from the side so you can see what my hands are doing. So here, it's an interesting design choice. I think they were trying to find a way to make the weapon look weighty, and moving around to this side just didn't work for them aesthetically, which I can see. It's just that spin is very strange. Now, that's interesting to note, by the way, is that the Highlander doesn't cross his hands at any point during these, except for when you're in the loading screen. When everyone launches into their attacks against each other, the Highlander will do a cross hands cut. So he does actually a rather lovely Unterhau, and he doesn't do that in game. I don't know why, it's very strange. But the other attacks out of his offensive stance are going to be his heavies and then his kick. So for his heavies, they're pretty straightforward. He goes up into his offensive stance and he will chop, chop. So he will do full passing steps on these guys. And oftentimes when I'm playing him and we get someone sandwiched in a corner, it's just boom, 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 over and over and over again. Not too complicated, really. It's interesting to note that on that one, he doesn't really spin anymore. He just hauls it back up and swings again. Maybe it's the adrenaline. Now for his kicks, that's where things get a little bit more interesting. So when he's in his offensive stance on the high, he will do just a straight push kick. He always kicks with the whole of his foot, so he's not extending his toes like a teep kick, neither is he pushing his heel out. It's always going to be just that sort of kick. When he's on the low guards, he will kick with whatever leg is in front, versus up here, he'll always kick with his right leg. So if he's here, he will side kick. It's a rather crisp little side kick, and most of his kicks are aimed kind of around here-ish. I don't know if he's looking to buckle their hip or hit them, in the squishy bits here, but he's usually aiming pretty low. So for here, boom, back. On the other side, it's going to be boom, back. Pretty straightforward. Now the other thing that the Highlander has that he will use is his grab, his caber toss. For that one, you're in the offensive stance. He takes 2 big passing steps forward before grabbing onto the opponent, usually in the upper trapezoid area. He'll grab them, trapezius, anyway. He'll grab them, and then when he goes to throw, he'll look, step around, and then toss. It's actually a rather structured throw on his part, and given how strong he seems to be, I wouldn't be surprised if he's knocking people over. Looks a little weird when he does to Shigoki though. So here's that again from, we'll do it that way. So he's in his offensive stance, step, grab, look, boom, and then they're on the ground. So that's the Highlander's basic moveset. Not terribly complicated. What can we infer about it? I really think it was supposed to be done with a big club or something along those lines. And just for sake of reference, I have a small tree branch here that I will do some of the moves with it to show that. So let's take a look at that real quick. So, if we look at his guards, they make a lot more sense when he's got something along these lines, because I don't really want to put my hands together on this guy. I want good control over high and low. Up here, yeah, that feels much better. Since it's resting on my shoulder, I can propel it a lot more. For his lights, we just, we're pushing it into it, and then we recover it. For his heavies, we've got, I can see that recommitment back to sides. For his slam, even, see? Things along those lines. In fact, letting go with that hand might have made that not hit as hard in regards to how it rebounded on me. For his offensive stance, boom, that's not crazy. Switching sides, again, that transition's weird, but whatever. Things of that nature. So I think it makes a little bit more sense if he'd had a big old tree branch like this. But we will see that again in a moment, because I forgot to go over his area attack. So, play his area attack and his unlocked run-in. So, probably two of his cooler attacks is one, if you are not locked onto someone and you just run in, he will do two sideways heavies, and they have again that skip step, which I rather like. So he'll run in, boom, boom. May have to angle this a little bit so we get the whole thing on camera, but skip, boom, skip, boom. And I just think it's interesting to see that little shuffle step. So he does that on his unlocks. Then on his area attack, this is probably the most complicated cuts he does. So for his area attack, it's 3 wide cuts, great for clearing minions. But what it is he will start off with a normal cut as he steps. As he goes to turn on his next cut, back up, he will cut around with the short edge. So he is letting go and swinging through. He raises the arms up, covers himself before cutting through on his last cut. So here is that again from the front this time. So cut 1, cut 2, cover, cut 3. I've always liked it, especially when he covers above the head, just because it looks really, really cool. But otherwise, it's just pretty much still in line with what he does. I don't know why he switches to the short edge. I mean, it's kind of interesting because off that first cut, since he winds himself up so much, he could just keep both hands on the sword and it would all still work out the same. Probably just a stylistic thing. But now we move on finally to his executions and an emote. So, the execution I've chosen to do with him today is going to be his, I think it's called No Mercy, but basically it's going to be the person falls down on the ground and they're propping themselves up with an arm, he chops off the arm, and then finishes them with a thrust. Now the interesting thing about it is how he reverses his hand to cut. So, when he goes to chop the arm, which is about this level, he switches to a thumb-to-thumb grip, cuts through, and then straight down. The reason I find this interesting is that he and the Kensai also do it, and they're the only ones that do, which it's perfectly valid way to cut. It will, do the job. And as far as cutting a low target, it makes a lot more sense for him to do so. So I really like that little thoughtful detail of making it a bit different. Because for the most part, the Highlander's executions are not all that exciting. Ubisoft took many, many seasons to figure out how to use a big sword in a cool way. But here's that again, this time from the side. So here, cuts, thrust, pull, we're back to guard. Now for his emote, I have chosen, I don't remember what it's called, I think it's heave-ho, but basically he does a little caber toss. So what he does, I'll show it with this real quick, but what he does is he just puts both hands onto the pommel, 1, 2, and then throws, and the sword sticks in the ground. Now, the reason I like this emote is that the emphasis is on it coming down straight at the 12 o'clock, as opposed to it turning over. In case you don't know much about tossing cabers, the idea is you're supposed to have it come down as close to 12 o'clock as you can, as opposed to it just flipping over in the air, because that's the harder thing to do. So I think it's a really cool detail that it, rather than going the tumbling over like most people associate with caber toss, it sticks straight down. He goes, yup, and then goes and gets his sword. So I'll get the branch again, and we'll see how close to 12 I can get. This is probably going to be too light for this, but we will try all the same. So, he gets both hands underneath. 1, 2, nope, went over. Either way, that's the basic idea of the Highlander's moveset. I think it's a pretty cool moveset overall. He does some interesting things, and there is a nice consistency as to how heavy the sword is to him, which is interesting. He even in some of his idle animations makes it look like he probably has some joint pain here and there. He will roll a shoulder out or things along those lines. He will, for the most part, he keeps the sword straight up. Sometimes he will rest it down, and he often uses his foot to kick it back up onto his shoulder. So there's these cool little details there that they've put in that I thought were interesting. So, from a heavy, slow hitting, let's go to fast, light hitting. It's time for the Gladiator. Okay, so obviously I don't have a trident, but I do have this shortened spear, which is not necessarily, I mean, it's a little bit longer than what he's using. What he's using is only about yay long, but it'll work all the same. So, the Gladiator has probably one of my favorite movesets in the whole game. I also think he might have a little bit of a injured leg, but we'll get back to that again in a moment. But basically, the Gladiator's whole shtick is that he has quick, light little jabs. Very similar to if you've watched my Hoplite video on the channel. He's going to go out, hit, and then retract. And there's a lot more emphasis on the retract than I remembered, so I was looking up footage to remind myself in practice. He really does rip it back out when he hits. Given that some of his tridents are barbed, I could see that. Now, he is an assassin, which means he only has a temporary guard when he moves around. For the most part, he sticks very tight and very in. He's basically got a boxer stance, and he moves very much like a boxer does. Very light, very flowy, and he also always makes a nice exhale on his attacks. Rather than a tss, he will instead be going yoop, which out of just, you know, screwing around doing this a little bit in sparring earlier in the year, kind of started to enjoy doing that. But either way. So he has 4 lines of attack, distinct lines, rather than just 3. Here's how. He will attack low and kind of upward into his attack, recover. And when he attacks from high, he goes pretty much straight over the shoulder. When he attacks from the other side of his head, it's again high, but it's kind of curling over. And then he will attack low, basically like an ice pick dagger attack from below. So really, he can attack in 4 directions, which is quite intriguing. So he's got 1, 2, 3, 4. And the buckler is pretty much just kept nice and tight to his body the whole time. Now, as far as just, you know, easy to do moveset, this one is quite simple. It's just extending and then retracting. The buckler is just held up here for defense, and I really like that he mostly uses it as just pretty much a static ward. He will use it in his parries a little bit more. So, When he goes into his heavies, that's when things get a little bit more interesting, as he has two versions of heavies. So his light is just a normal attack and then retract. For his heavy, he will either grab ahead of his hand and thrust with both arms. So here's that again. Grab, thrust, and he can do that in pretty much all directions. He will also, if he comes onto this side, he will grab behind his hand and thrust. Same thing here. But if he does a follow-up heavy, or it's a heavy off of a light, he instead will grab behind his hand. So let's go heavy. He will switch to then strike with it in a very similar way to the Highlander was moving. Now, I'll tell you this right now. Having done a little bit fast, it's going to be the bane of your fingertips, because I have cracked my fingers between the buckler handle and this haft more than a few times doing this particular move, but here it is again. So, light, heavy, heavy. Pretty straightforward. He also uses the same sort of animation when he does the sticking. So he'll stick, draw it out, and then he also has a smack with the buckler off of that. But that's pretty much his basics. The other thing he has is he will jump with a thrust. It's called, I believe, the crowd pleaser. It's pretty straightforward. He just, really simple, very, very Troy movie with Brad Pitt. Nothing too complicated about it. Now, the other things he has is he will do movement to the side, one side or the other, and I wish I could do it as smooth as he can. But essentially, when an attack comes in, he can either step to the side and just do a quick jab, or he will float and jab on this side. Very light, very airy, very smooth. I love it when I get to see this particular move, even if it's being done to me, because it's like, attack, nope, and he just is ready to go again. Now, the other thing he will do is he will dodge and use his buckler punch. Now, what's interesting about this one is when he dodges to this side, he will float and he will kind of uppercut into usually the body. He usually punches with the flat of the buckler as opposed to the rim. It's 6 1/2 dozen, it hurts either way. But this side, he will load it, strike out, versus the other side, he will often come over his shoulder, so kind of a slam punch from above. Just a neat little bit of differentiation. And I really like that about the way they made him move, is that he doesn't like to cross his body up all that much, and when he does, it's usually in a limited capacity. Now, those are his buckler punches. The other one he has, of course, being off of a parry. So when he parries, he will mostly parry with the haft, very much like a sword. He's just using this end. He will bring his buckler up to protect as well, clear, and usually straight into the body once again. So here's that from the side. We're here, clear. Just a nice little hit to the ribs and things like that. Not too complicated. So characterization-wise, what can we infer about him based on that little bit of moveset? Honestly, he really does embody the professional fighter sort of thing. He's very much a duelist. His moveset is very linear and focused on one guy at a time, but it's clear he's been doing this for quite a while. His movesets are tight, his movements are crisp, they look very well trained, and he just embodies a professional fighter. So as far as characterization through movement and coming up with a really cool moveset for this weapon combination, I think Ubisoft really did knock it out of the park. Now, back to a thing I mentioned earlier is, I mentioned that I believe he has a leg injury. The reason I say that is because he leans very heavily on one side, specifically on his spear side, when he's in his idle animation. This could just be general sort of leaning stuff, but also when he runs, I have noticed that he has just a tiniest bit of limp on his left side. Not a ton, just a little bit. And I just find that particularly intriguing because given that he is a high-performing athlete and, specifically in a blood sport, a knee injury would not be a crazy thing to have. especially if he's been doing it for so long that he started to go out to fight in the battlefield. This is also, in my belief, compounded by the fact that one of his executions, he goes to thrust at someone, and they've rolled away. They kick him in his supporting leg. Now, we talked about how I think the limp is on the left side, so kicking him in this, what it does is it puts all the weight onto that side, so he drops to a knee very quickly. So it's just interesting that they added in that little detail and how much it devastates him. Because, I mean, don't get me wrong, getting a kick on that side sucks, but have you seen the man's thighs? It just buckles him a little bit more than I would have expected. However, if he has that knee injury on his left side, and all of a sudden, boom, all that weight is put down right on top of it, I can absolutely see him going to a knee very quickly. So that's just a little bit of interesting characterization I think is there. It may not be, but that's what it looks like to me. Now, time for, let's see, making sure I've got everything done. Well, he has his area of attack, which is honestly pretty straightforward. He will, how does he do it? He will basically take this onto the back of his shoulders and just whip with it. We'll see a lot more of that from the Valkyrie when I do that. That one's going to take a lot of practice. It's overall pretty simplistic. But let's move on to his emotes and his executions. So, for his execution, the one I've chosen is, he has a lot of really great ones, though I've noticed that a lot of them seem to focus on stabbing the toe first, which I think is unfortunate, because his initial executions were a lot more varied, and I really liked the way he was showcasing his professionalism, versus now it's all just, you know, the toe stab. And on that note, by the way, the only other really significant move he has is he will stab the toe, smack with the haft, and then move on from there. Nothing too exciting. But the one I have chosen is he will instead, after he's landed his heavy, he will rip it out, smack with the haft, take the haft and go underneath the leg, rip up, switch, and then stab. It's a very smooth motion, and it also showcases something that's not shown a lot with polearms, which is that they're just a big lever. It's really not that hard to trip someone with these. So here is it again. So he's launched his heavy to land, comes out, smack, here. I messed up the turn on that one. Let me do it again. Smack, boom, boom, here, overthrough, stick. It's just a particularly cool move, and I really liked it. I'll do it one more time on this side. So, stab, through, smack, trip, through, stab. In case you don't know how to twirl a spear or a stick around your hand, all you do is just basically open your hand. So as it's going over, I just release and I let it go as I turn my wrist over, then trap it once again. A little bit of practice, it's not too difficult. But it does look really cool that he adds that emphasis and then finishes off with a relatively simple thrust. And all his finishes are really pretty simple. Just stab them where they're gonna bleed quickest and then move on. Now for emotes, the one I've chosen is a little bit strange. The reason I chose this one is actually because of a good buddy of mine who he's the one who made the idea for this series. But it's that it kind of has some interesting lore implications. So the emote in question is when he takes a break. So he'll be standing around and he will go. Now the reason that one is interesting is because that motion is meant to simulate a gun. Does this mean that guns exist in the For Honor universe? We don't know. It's a very strange one, but all that one is he's lounging around as his normal self. He just so relatively straightforward. But either way, that is the Gladiator's moveset. It's a really fun moveset. I really like it. And I have even sparred using some of his moves. I really like them. So it's pretty fun. It's pretty cool. But altogether, that's my second episode for this series. Hope you guys liked it. And we'll tackle some other heroes another time.